Chapter 16. Big Deal at Amen Corner. Therefore, we are at the point of recognizing fully what a grand chance lottery was the creation of the Scofield Reference Bible. Not only was Cyrus Scofield a mightily unlikely person to carry out such a monumental work, but several logarithmic levels of improbability predate Scofield on the path. At its historically knowable end, the main branch of the path ran from the drawing rooms of some very large Anglo-Irish estates in southern Ireland onwards to England, then British North America, and lastly to the United States. One says historically knowable, meaning the point where one can document a continuous chain of individual and assembly interaction with the sacred text. Prior to that, there is the massive tapestry of Jewish Christian history, huge in scale, but with large holes and threadbare patches, just at the points where one desperately wants to know more. In the 3 volumes of the present study, we have looked into detail after particular detail, because simply asserting that world-forming ideas moved across oceans is not sufficient. Individual agency, and hence individual biography, counts. The key instrument when dealing with a narrative that is so rich in detail is to adopt critical path analysis and to avoid flaccid appeals to the spirit of the age or similar nostrums. We have been dealing with individuals, and when appropriate, collections of individuals, as vectors in the transport of ideas. The ideas they transported, and sometimes augmented, have been treated very seriously, for they created one of the most radical forms of Christianity ever to be successful with large numbers of adherents. The sort of transnational path that I have presented and analyzed here has not been attractive to most historians who deal with U.S. evangelicalism from the mid-19th century onwards. They have preferred a story that is indigenous, in the old sense of the word, meaning one that has Made in America labels pasted all over it. The course of transmission from the Old World to British North America and thence to the United States of the complex and seductive foreign constructs that became the dominant form of American dispensationalism is just too complicated, alien, and for some, too worldly. To interrogate it requires at least a modest historical competence in societies and cultures other than one's own. There are some very strong U.S. strands in the narrative we have here been shaping, and in this regard, the overarching concept of enculturation has informed the story, while letting the transnational narrative develop of its own force. Among the virtues of that concept is that it alerts the observer to the changes a new religious system effects when moved to a new environment, and at the same time, it suggests that we pay attention to the ways the new ambient conditions revise the original ideational imports. In this specific case, Americanization is not a bad term. However shrewd was the initial idea for the Scofield Reference Bible, and however trustworthy were its Plymouth Brethren funders, it is a marvel that the SRB ever was completed, much less published by a top-echelon firm. The Reverend Cyrus I. Scofield, wanting in health and inconstant in application, largely wasted the first 2.5 years of his self-advertised period of study, 1902 to 1909, and only in early 1905 got stuck in seriously, and even then he had to take long breaks. The book was published at the beginning of 1909, so he really was devoted fully to the project for only 4 years, if that. To be sure, he had some useful associates and helpers, and a ready-made template from his brethren contacts and his colleagues in the old Niagara Conference Network, and he had his own years of thinking and preaching on his truly heroic topic, the mechanics of how the Holy Scriptures worked. What could not have been foreseen was the fortuitous relationship that he developed with Henry Froude, 1841 to 1927, publisher of the Oxford University Press, an exclusive brother, and the most influential person in the English-speaking world in the publication, not the content, the publication of English-language Bibles. This intersection occurred at a time when Froude was alert for a strong seller to sustain the press's young American operation. Once again, Scofield fell into goodly company. To put the pivotal relationship with Froude into context, we need to return to the other crucial relationship in the production of the SRB, that between Scofield and A.C. Gaebelein. We have seen that very early in the 20th century, Scofield had acquired the participation of the go-ahead Gaebelein, an expert on prophecy, an early and strong Zionist, and a talented fundraiser. As a junior partner of an undefined sort, Gaebelein, influenced directly by Plymouth Brethren, had severed ties with existing denominations, but did not join even with the Brethren. He was a solo practitioner, a very early American evangelical separatist, half a century ahead of his time, a remarkably strong individual. Gaebelein nevertheless was willing to subordinate himself to Scofield on the Big Bible project. Either he reckoned that substantive influence on the content was more important than being recognized as a co-creator, or alternately, that he would be credited generously for the work he did. He later seemed to have second thoughts on the matter. At the Seacliff Conferences of 1901 and 1902, the annual event created by Gaebelein that ran at Seacliff through 1911 and was discontinued then because of the death of its patron, John T. Peary, Scofield, with Gaebelein's help, put forward a pitch. They would have hated the word, but that was the task for a major reference Bible. And by the end of the second conference, funding from wealthy Plymouth brothers was in place. That each man in his recollections has himself as the chief fundraiser is symptomatic of their relationship. What Scofield did from early 1903, when he left Northfield for Dallas, until early 1909, when the volume appeared, is unclear, and even less so is where he was. He performed some on and off duties for his Dallas church, filled some conference dates, and when the project started moving, did some editorial work at his camp on the Connecticut River and at the conference grounds on Lake Orion, Michigan. The big chunks of time, however, were taken up with 2, possibly 3 trips with his wife to England and Switzerland, with a break for the Holy Land. These were chronicled as research trips, but on 2 of them, he was in rest cures for months at facilities in the resort and spa town of Montreux, on the east end of Lake Geneva. Also, he had 1 and likely 2 extended visits to the Clifton Springs, New York sanitarium. Scofield and his wife Hetty also spent editorial time living and working in an apartment in New York City near the end of the enterprise. The difficulty here is not that it would have been impossible for Scofield to put together a highly complex project while never settling in any one place. Difficult, yes, but peripatetic life suited him, and if he wished to cart around trunks full of notes, and eventually of production boards, that was how he operated. What is beyond believable, however, is that within the time he had, and from which so much was subtracted by health issues, he could do most of the work himself. My own suggestion, only that, not a gavel-pounding certainty, is that Scofield got by only with the help of his friends. And I am not here referring to the name-dropping acknowledgments he has for window dressing at the front of his final product. Obviously, as we observed in the previous chapter, he was helped on the financial side by his Plymouth Brethren friends. Here, the question of assistance moves directly to spiritual matters, the character of his reference material, and to the production facilities required for a very complicated exercise in bookmaking. Friends enter again. The key exhibit is the contribution made by Arno Gaebelein. Granted, there were strategic mentions of useful people on the title page of the 1909 volume and in the introduction to the SRB, and Gaebelein was there. More about those acknowledgments later. But that was it. The 1920 authorized Life of Scofield by Charles G. Trumbull was based on almost no research. It had as its main source C.I. Scofield, and it accurately reflects what and how Scofield wanted his life to be remembered. There was a single mention of A.C. Gaebelein as one of the consulting editors, but nothing more. Now, against that are the 2 volumes of personal memoirs by Gaebelein, 1930 and 1943. In them are matters of recall by Gaebelein, many of them backed by quotations from correspondence and print sources that indicate a warmth of relationship between the 2 men, and some very heavy-duty help from Gaebelein in filling major portions of the SRB that Scofield could not do himself. So, in Scofield's authorized life story, we are dealing not with a minor memory lapse, but with yet another volitional erasure. In Gaebelein's The History of the Scofield Reference Bible, 1943, we have a memoir, not an historical chronicle in the professional sense, though it has lots of telling details. In it, one senses an author who is praying frequently that he may be generous and Christian, but who really wants to cry out that Scofield was a thief. It is a conflicted piece of writing, never overtly aggressive, but frequently latently aggrieved. The beginning of the project was promising, a time of morning sunshine. At the now familiar Second Seacliff Conference of 1902, Gaebelein had given a series of addresses entitled The Harmony of the Prophetic Word. In response, Dr. Scofield said they expressed the method he intended to follow in the Reference Bible. Pregnant declaration, that. And he urged the writer to prepare the material, with additional lectures, for publication in a volume. He declared such a volume would be most helpful to him in his Bible work. Gaebelein quickly put together the volume. It already was in outline from his public talks, and in November 1902, Scofield was sent the advance proofs. He responded by writing a 5-page foreword to The Harmony of the Prophetic Word that would have pleased any author. All students of prophecy are sure to be interested in a presentation of the chief contents of the prophetic scriptures, which are so original in scope and method. What the beginner could not do at all, not even the most persevering student for many months, is here done for him by an expert student of the prophetic writings. The method, Scofield's emphasis, is to take up the great prophetic epochs and events and bring together from the whole body of prophecy the testimony concerning them. These plaudits, put into a different context, could be taken as the 1-minute pitch for what Scofield's projected creation would do. There was craft here, both by Scofield and Gaebelein. The graceful book, 212 pages with wide margins and quality production, was a bonne bouche for the circle of brethren who had signed on a few months earlier to fund Scofield's project. The book was published by the printing publishing firm owned by Francis Fitch, one of the main underwriters of the Bible project, and implicitly it told the other investors that the authors were from. In this regard, Gaebelein was as much an accreditor of Scofield as vice versa. Recall that Fitch had experienced difficulty with Scofield's inconsistent application to duty and had been talked into line by Gaebelein. Without pushing the matter too far, note a coded message to the Plymouth Brethren benefactors, and to Brethren sympathizers generally, that Gaebelein inserted as a footnote. The quotations we make in this volume are neither of the authorized nor of the revised version. We use a translation which we believe, after a very careful examination, to be the best in existence. It is published in England. Correct. published in Germany and in France, and in its English version in the home country, yet not identified here because insiders would recognize it and outsiders would have been unnecessarily repelled. This was the translation of the Scriptures by John Nelson Darby. That endorsement of Darby scriptural scholarship is as close to a warranty of intent as could be made at the time, that in prophetic interpretation, brethren rules applied. A curious aspect of Cyrus Scofield's skill set was that his weak area was prophecy. He was deft, almost surgical, at segmenting the Holy Scriptures into pieces defined by the intersection of the several independent categories he considered integral to the text, but on prophecy as a coherent entity, he had problems, especially with integrating the wide range of Old Testament prophets into the whole. That is where Gaebelein, formerly a full-time proselytizer of Jewish settlers from Eastern Europe, came to the fore. Weaving ancient Hebrew prophecies into the New Testament material and packing everything neatly together was his strength. Not only did his The Harmony of the Gospel mention every minor prophet in the Hebrew Scriptures and tie each of them into the dispensational version of the Mosiah figure and the great day of Yahweh, but Gaebelein also wrote dense studies of several of the smaller prophetic texts. His studies in Zechariah, 1897, was the first of these, and aside from the prophet Joel, an exposition, 1909, during the first decade of the century, he was doing the research for his book on Matthew, 2 volumes, 1907 and 1910, Daniel, 1911, and his multi-volume, The Annotated Bible, 9 volumes, 1912 to 1922. Nevertheless, a large proportion of his research time in 1903 and following appears to have been given to helping Scofield. I had promised him every possible assistance by taking over certain sections of the Bible. Taking over is a revealing term, furnishing the analysis of certain books, and assisting in prophetic interpretations. Some time after Scofield had read and blurbed Gaebelein's Harmony, he requested the analysis of a number of the prophetic books and the interpretation of difficult and disputed prophetic prophecies. And Gaebelein added, while the Reference Bible was in the making, we received from him inquiries as to the dates of the so-called minor prophets, questions as to the book of Daniel and its prophetic interpretation, for help on certain portions of the book of Revelation, on some of the parables, as to 2 Thessalonians, chapter 2, etc. In industrial terms, Scofield appeared to be using Gaebelein as a subcontractor. Gaebelein did the job, and this was recognized by a letter of the 2nd of September 1905 from Scofield that Gaebelein published both in facsimile and in transcript. It included the following sentence: I sit at your feet when it comes to prophecy, and congratulate in advance the future readers of the Reference Bible on having in their hands a safe, a clear, a sane guide through what to most is a labyrinth. A reasonable inference is that the year 1905 was when Scofield finally began seriously to pay attention to his scholarly obligations. Trumbull suggests, again without any actual dates, that Scofield at Montreux, on Lake Geneva, had suffered a weakening of his faith as to God's purpose to provide the money and see him through this tremendous task. He came back to the United States and for a time took up pastoral work in Dallas, and then the Lord took care of all the money needs, and he gave himself over almost entirely to the project. Certainly, as the letter to Gaebelein indicates, by the autumn of 1905 he was seriously into the work. He had Gaebelein sorting out one of the main parables that, in Brethren doctrine, related to the rapture of the church. The parable of the 10 virgins, 5 wise, 5 foolish, Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 to 13. At some point, Scofield put together an actual plan for the project and sent it to Gabeline. It was a good one, in that it was clear. It had, no surprise, 7 operational parts based on the silo principle, that the Bible was a self-interpreting book. 1. A wholly new system of references, by which he meant chain references running through the text. 2. Definitions in footnotes of the great words of the Bible, some 60 in all. 3. Divisions were to be indicated, meaning structural divides in each biblical book, and also the dispensational divisions. 4. Fulfilled prophecies were to be distinguished from those yet to unfold. 5. Types were to be treated conservatively on the silo principle that nothing was to be accepted as a type which is not elsewhere affirmed in the sacred text. 6. The more important themes in Scripture were to be grouped together in orderly footnotes. And 7. A pronunciation guide for hard foreign words was to make the work fit into the category of self-pronouncing Bibles. The only obvious criticism of this plan is that all the apparatus might cramp the Holy Scripture. In referring to his own work, Gabeline mentions a rich correspondence with Scofield that continued throughout the decade, but does not foreground himself. The project was Scofield's. He does, though, want the reader to infer, I think correctly, that the prophetic material was mostly his contribution, or at least written on his authority. In perspective, that is a big contribution indeed. With Gabeline's implicit claim to being a primary contributor, perhaps the primary source of the detailed prophetic material in its final form in the Scofield Reference Bible of 1909, we must briefly jump out of strict chronology and at a fairly high level of generality look at the shape of the 1909 volume. It is unabashedly from first word to last about Jesus the Christ. No event, past or present, had meaning, or indeed reality, except as part of that story. Because the final chapters in the Jesus story had yet to be written, the SRB, if it is to be true to its mandate, had to be shaped as a colossal prophetic engine. Obviously, a text that contains 2 universe-bending events, creation and the incarnation of Jesus the Christ, will have a large degree of front-loading. That is, Genesis and Matthew receive overwhelmingly the greatest amount of annotation, much of it being set-up work for the books of Scripture that follow. That term, annotations, is the key. They are the superordinate comments of the author of the Reference Bible that determine the meaning of the KJV text. In regard to the Gospels and Acts, Matthew receives more than half the interpretative diktats. That, in part, as mentioned before, is a matter of opening location, but I believe there is more to it. The exclusive brethren hermeneutical system was troublesome to most evangelicals because it interpreted Matthew as being Jewish, and thus not directly for Christians, a twist that necessitated distracting, often irrelevant footnotes at the bottom of most of its pages. There is more to it than that, however, because the SRB requires that every sentence of the Scriptures be read as a component of a future program. Often this is explicitly prophetic, but equally important is the implacable counting of dispensations, of course, but also of covenants, of judgments, and indeed everything that occurs over time is sequential, and this can be enumerated. No integer has its own integrity. Each implies the one that comes after it, and thus ties into the final prophetically defined ending. And some other things that appear to be purely dichotomous, law versus grace, the old nature versus the new, mere professors versus true believers, are implicitly sequential in that the better item in the duo is expected to replace the lesser item, and thus are a numerically short sequence. Even in interpretative points, such as the list of the 7 compound names of the Almighty, a note to Genesis chapter 2, the numerical listing acts to habituate the reader to the march of sequence. American dispensationalism embraced the one fundamental division that is not sequential, the hermeneutic principle introduced by the Brethren in the late 1820s and 1830s, that, although the Scriptures form a unity, individual portions are intended either for a Jewish audience or potential Christians. From this there follows the separation of Israel and the Church, which is not sequential, unlike the case in most other Christian theologies. This separation is conjoined only at the second coming and the subsequent fulfillment of promises to both entities. The prophetic template dominates the entire SRB project. This is made obvious at the other side of the rhetorical balance wheel from the heavy loading on front matters as found in Genesis and Matthew. The far end of each of the Testaments, Revelation in the New Testament, and Zechariah and Malachi at the end of the Old, receive large amounts of ink. Of course, as a simple empirical prediction, one would expect the Old Testament prophetic books to receive the greatest amount of attention, proportionately to their size, for that is where most of the prophecies actually are concerning Israel. The book of Daniel is the obvious instance, and there hardly a page goes by without an editorial intervention. The surprising points of emphasis, however, are Zechariah and Malachi, the 2 final books of the Old Testament. Alone among the commentaries in the entire Bible, they have an editorial intervention on every page, an investment that goes beyond the cleanup detailing that one would expect at the end of the Hebrew Scriptures. These form a modern composition marker. Recall that Arno Gabelein's earliest prophetic book, 1897, was on Zechariah, and that his Harmony on Prophecy, 1903, was about the Old Testament prophets, and moreover, he was preparing works on Joel and Daniel. In these areas, save for the book of Daniel, Scofield had shown little interest or expertise. Still, in the introduction to the 1909 SRB, Clause 8, he wrote the following concerning the Old Testament prophetic books. This portion of the Bible, nearly 1/4 of the whole, has been closed to the average reader by fanciful and allegorical schemes of interpretation. The Scofield Reference Bible would correct that. Back to the business side of the project. Here, as with Arno Gabelein's prophetic expertise, Cyrus Scofield was blessed with well-resourced friends. One of his acquaintances from the Niagara conferences of the 1890s, or from Northfield meetings, accounts vary, was a senior partner in the London publishing firm of Morgan and Scott, and this contact was crucial in extracting Scofield's project from the swamp of American Bible publishing. Swamp indeed. From 1776 onwards, the English royal patent on the authorized version entered the public domain outside of the British Isles and Empire. With the rise in literacy in the 19th century, myriad versions came on the market. William V. Trollinger, Jr. calculates that in the period that encloses Scofield's work, 1880 to 1940, there were 450 Protestant editions of the Bible published in the United States. Many of these were by Bible societies and by denominational authorities, but theft was common. Large newspapers went so far as to put out pirate editions. The Chicago Tribune sold over 100,000 pirate copies of the revised version of the Scriptures almost immediately after the edition's publication in England. U.S. copyright laws protected items printed in the United States, but not those first printed elsewhere. More of that in a moment. So the Bible was lifted shamelessly, and all sorts of editions, pictures, red letter, highlighted and abridged, circulated. Bible floggers, often of dubious character, sold editions door to door, promoting, for example, high-priced calf-bound family Bibles that had in their center empty ruled pages, sufficient to record generation after generation of family members. Anything that would sell was sold. The Scofield Reference Bible came very close to being pulled into that morass. Scofield entered negotiations with a young brethren-friendly New York publishing operation, the Gospel Publishing House of D.T. Bass. It was a wedge firm in the dispensational wing of American evangelicalism with some credibility. It had in train Arthur T. Pearson's second set of Exeter Hall lectures, eventually published in 1908, but it was very small time. According to Arno Gabeline, some of the brethren backers favored this firm, but others, including Francis Fitch and himself, felt that such a small concern, totally unknown, with no capital at all, would spell failure for the Bible. There is a diverting story, about 50% fictional, in variant forms in Scofield's bio and in Gabeline's memoir, that has the older Mr. Scott, Robert Scott, of the evangelical publishing firm of Morgan and Scott, taking Scofield and Hetty down to his country house near Dorking, Surrey, for a stay. There the projected reference Bible was discussed, and, among much recreated dialogue, Scott is astounded to hear that Scofield has not yet selected a publisher, as if he actually had a project in presentable shape. Scott is reported as selflessly saying that his firm would gladly publish the reference Bible, but that there was only one publisher in existence who could give this Bible the worldwide introduction it must have: Oxford University Press. "I do not know anyone connected with the Oxford Press," Scofield said. "I can easily arrange that," was Scott's reply, and forthwith he took his friend to call upon Mr. Henry Froude, the chief of the great Oxford University Press. All that was said to have occurred in the autumn of 1904, none of it strictly accurate, but some of it informative. Actually, Scott made contact for Scofield in late 1905, and Scofield did not meet Henry Froude until the spring of 1906. Despite the romanticization of the transaction, the accepted fiction has the three basic actors on stage: the firm of Morgan and Scott, the powerful but strangely structured Oxford University Press, and the sometimes spectral figure of Henry Froude. We should take those in order. Morgan and Scott were not a philanthropy, but as evangelical publishers, they believed in doing good while doing well, and according to their lights, had done quite a bit of both. The history of the firm was intertwined with the events and characters that are part of the transnational migration of the proto-dispensational belief system from Ireland to England, and thence to Canada and the United States, and its modification into American dispensationalism. The founder of the firm, Richard Cope Morgan, 1827 to 1908, while a master printer with a Bath firm, experienced an evangelical conversion, worshipped with the brethren for a time, and in 1859 started his own small publishing operation in London. He was greatly moved by what he learned of the Irish revival of 1859 to 1861, and he particularly approved of Henry Bewley's assembly at Marion Hall, Dublin. In 1859, he began a periodical, The Revival, which carried news first of the Irish events and later of revivalism throughout the English-speaking world. The business evolved into a book and periodical house in 1870, with Morgan becoming partner with Robert Scott. In seeming recognition of the firm's growing scope, The Revival became The Christian. As we observed earlier, Morgan was cultivated by Dwight L. Moody during his first major British Isles campaign. And, to be fair, Moody was cultivated by Morgan. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. It is slightly jarring, but not inaccurate, to suggest that Morgan, with his bi-weekly pumping of Moody throughout that first campaign, 1873 to 1875, did for Moody what William Randolph Hearst did for Billy Graham in 1949, made him into feature news. Thereafter, the firm of Morgan and Scott was the UK publishing house that had the tightest bead on the main line of American revivalists, and especially those who hovered around emergent dispensationalism. Arcope Morgan and Robert Scott were visibly in support of Moody's later British campaigns, and notable at Northfield sessions, where they prospected for coming attractions. And well, they should do so. Their firm had acquired the UK rights to several versions of the Moody and Sankey songbooks, which, as we earlier observed, by 1927 had sold 70 million British Isles copies. Thus, when Cyrus Scofield, a well-known figure in American dispensational circles, arrived on their shores, of course the firm looked after him. The immediate task fell to Scott, for Morgan, after his first wife died in the mid-1890s, spent much of his time visiting and supporting various non-denominational evangelical missions in Africa and Asia. Not to mention that he eventually married an energetic Polish woman 40 years his junior, Wilhelmina Marysiana Filipina Deńska Mazur. Robert Scott did the right thing and served as dragoman for Scofield, introducing him to the scarcely mapped world of Oxford publishing. And what a complicated place it was. Wonderful in its way, but without help, very difficult for an outsider to navigate. It is worth our spending a minute with the outline map of that fog-shrouded land, since without paying attention to its unusual features, the appearance with an Oxford label of the Scofield Reference Bible makes little sense. Oxford University Press has a fine recent 4-volume history that covers both business and cultural aspects of the firm, and there is the added resource of a revealing popular history and also of published anecdotal reminiscences. Still, unless one is an enthusiast of publishing history, an historical encounter with the Oxford publishing world in the Victorian era reminds one of the early contact reports of Occidental merchants and explorers entering Yuan China in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Travelers moved through rich valleys, forded streams and rivers that often seemed to run the wrong way, and when they went upland, met vapors, then fog, then clouds. There were shrouded hills, and suddenly brief bursts of sunlight and glorious vistas, and then more clouds. The kingdom had no end of scurrying servitors, but who was in charge was rarely clear, and once, just once, in these first encounters, visitors were privileged to meet the head of the great clerisy. He, in his austere office, referred reverently through his interpreter to his masters, a sanhedrinal circle so pure and learned that its members could not hold even a calligraphy brush, so long were their glossed fingernails. The whole kingdom levitated, supported by some resource too precious to be mined by unclean hands. Obviously, we are talking about Oxford University Press, and the precious resource is the Holy Scriptures, and that meant the Protestant Bible in the English language. The Bible privilege, the right to print the authorized version and earlier Bibles, was given to 3 entities in the 17th century: the King's Printer and the 2 universities, Cambridge in 1629 and Oxford in 1632. One can conveniently think of the privilege as a shared copyright, although technically it was somewhat different, being bestowed before modern copyright existed. Significantly, The Bible privilege was granted to the university prior to the university presses coming into existence, chartered in 1636 and becoming operational as a publisher in 1662. And that is a nice image of the situation as it existed into the early 20th century. The press was more dependent upon the Bible than the Bible was upon the press. The embryonic press developed a two-front tactical policy: learned books, and from 1780 onwards, a Bible partnership with trade printers that lasted in various forms until 1881, when the press took back control of its own Bibles. The sale of Bibles was far and away the main product line during the 19th century. In 1846, the press was selling almost 1.5 million Bibles and ancillary items, such as Anglican prayer books. The exogenous forces of rapid population growth in the British Isles, increased literacy, and evangelically stimulated interest in biblical knowledge lifted the figures in the second half of the century, and so too did smart marketing. In the mid-1890s, Bible and prayer book sales were 2.9 million annually. There were 80 different editions, including 40 of the King James Version. In the last one-third of the 19th century and onward, the press underwent massive changes. Publishing internationally was becoming something quite different from running a big print shop, and these are exciting for historians to observe and chronicle. However, in Oxford's case, it is necessary to remember that the legacy that made large commercial expansion possible was the Bible business. It was not a played-out mine. To maintain briefly the vantage point provided by the sales figures from the mid-1890s cited earlier, that is just before the New York branch was established, the press, although on the edge of becoming a major industrial cultural entity, was still a mist-bound land. The press of Oxford University existed, certainly, but until the 20th century, it did not exist as Oxford University Press. One notes on books and trade lists such identifications as Oxford, at the University Press, 1881, and Oxford, printed at the University Press, 1878, and London, Henry Froude, Oxford University Press Warehouse, 7 Paternoster Row, 1880. Whatever the enterprise was called, the University of Oxford owned it, although that might have come as a surprise to most members of the university. In theory, direct authority was exercised by a board of delegates, who sometimes intervened directly, but at other times projects were begun, edited, and printed between their meetings without reference to them. A key figure, for better, or often worse in this period, was the secretary to the delegates, a full-time position. The incumbent was expected to be a conduit of information to the delegates and a mechanism of control on their behalf. In the last half of the 19th century, there were several entities that essentially were separate businesses that were being brought into varying degrees of vertical integration: printing plants, bindery, paper production, sales and distribution, warehousing, and almost as an afterthought, a method of editorial instigation of learned monographs, Bibles, dictionaries, and increasingly trade books of an intellectual sort. Performance, and to a large degree control, of these separate functions was split between London and Oxford, and the main London operation, designated for most of this period as the Oxford Bible Warehouse, but increasingly the London business, had a separate individual designated as publisher to the university. The finances of the entire constellation were beyond analysis, the only clear point being that some profit was turned over to the university each year. Anybody straying into this land needed help. Robert Scott put Cyrus Scofield into contact with Henry Froude, publisher to the university, and pivotally, head of the London business that controlled Bible publishing and quite a bit else. Here we are at one of those strange moments where hindsight yields a narrative that is just too seductive, too apt to lead us to put our hands on the hot stove of questionable historical practice, and to declare that separate skeins of historical improbabilities were destined to come together, and thus, in some unspoken metaphysical or theological way, turn not just into probabilities, but maybe even certainties. Here we have two tracts of individual biography that had the potential to intersect, but a frightfully small likelihood of that happening. In recent chapters, we have traced the emergence of American dispensationalism, the central form of the belief system, which runs through James Hall Brooks and the Niagara Conference. Part of the continuation of that narrative involves Cyrus Scofield and his swerving personal journey. It eventually yielded a major scriptural innovation, but that was achieved only with the heavy lifting of Henry Froude on the design, production, and dissemination side of the work. As personalities, Scofield and Froude could scarcely have been less alike. One a public figure, the other a recluse. One a perpetual traveler, the other a stay-at-home. One cavalier about deadlines, the other a stickler. One loose with money, the other an accountant at heart. We have already enough of Scofield's life in mind to allow reflection, but know nothing yet of Froude. As an anchor point, December 1873 is useful. In that month, Cyrus Scofield, 30 years old, was resigning in disgrace from his appointment as U.S. Attorney for the Kansas District. Henry Froude, 32 years of age, was being vetted by the secretary to the Oxford delegates to become manager of the press's Bible warehouse in London. From that date, while keeping Scofield in mind, observe Froude, 1841 to 1927. The youngish man who took over as head of Oxford's Bible warehouse in London was the right sort of person from a managerial standpoint, but culturally was from the wrong side of the tracks, and this turned out to be one of his strengths. His father died when young Henry Froude was 9 years of age. In his mid-teens, he was supporting his mother in their lodging in Clerkenwell, London, for a time working for the post office. Then, in 1857, aged 16, he lucked into a job with a highly respectable publisher, the Religious Tract Society. This body, founded in 1799, was non-denominationally Protestant, and by mid-19th century had a surprisingly wide range of publications, from tiny tracts through narrative books that came close to being religious novels, to heavy volumes of theology, for an example, an analysis of Butler's Analogy of Religion, to an annotated paragraph Bible published under their own imprint, but printed by the holder of the Bible privilege. Both on a publishing level and for physical location, in the heart of the London publishing district, this was a fine place to become a bookseller's assistant, as Froude, aged 20, was recorded in the 1861 census. That memory may have simplified somewhat Froude's early years is not a great problem. If, as one source implies, he had some Joe jobs with various booksellers before landing firmly with the Religious Tract Society, it makes no great difference. What I think is unstated is that sometime in the late 1860s or very early 1870s, he went to work for Oxford in the Bible and Prayer Book operation, and he did well. The 1871 census has him living in Croydon in a flat with its own address, in Teignmouth Villas, with two near elderly women, his mother and his aunt. He is now an assistant in wholesale bookhouse. A more direct reason for inferring that he had moved to the London business is that when it became clear in 1873 that a new manager of the Bible warehouse would be required, the mathematician Bartholomew Price, FRS, Sedleyan Professor of Natural Philosophy and Secretary to the Delegates, 1867 to 1884, recruited Froude and put his appointment through the delegates. Price was both competent and canny, and he was not likely to have hired just any promising chap from the religious society across the road. Granted, Henry Froude once had been that legendary creature sought in Victorian papers, smart lad required, but over the years he had done a long internship at the Religious Tract Society and at the Oxford Press's London operation, and was a publishing professional. Nevertheless, at the point when Froude takes over the Bible and prayer book operation, we know more about his soul than we do about his actual business experience. Not that Froude left a spiritual diary, but for his entire religious life he was an exclusive brother, that is, a Darbyite, and there was not a lot of room for doctrinal or behavioral variation in that set. Even if Froude never encountered John Nelson Darby in London assemblies, he may have, he certainly knew saints who had frequently and deeply engaged with the great man. As far as Froude's concept of the supernatural, his perception of what the Scriptures were, and the restrictions on his own social life, severe, one can simply plug into the standard storyboard that we have defined in detail earlier in this study. What branch of the exclusives Froude followed after the Brethren splits that started in 1881 began, and increased after the death of Darby in 1882, is impossible to say. It is clear that Froude's faith did not interfere with his producing religious works of the Church of England, such as the Book of Common Prayer, of various Protestant writers, and of new translations of the Holy Scriptures. And in his expansive years in the early 20th century, Froude published a large number of books of secular high culture. In theory, in 1874 and immediately thereafter, Froude was subordinate, in some not quite defined way, to the publisher to the university, a position in London that had been created in 1863 when the delegates, realizing that the London operation was sprawling out of control, sought a remedy. They appointed the first incumbent, Alexander Macmillan, and he was responsible for putting out learned books as well as religious items, plus making money with commissioned printing and sales to the retail booksellers. Macmillan was part-time, he had his own firm to run, and Froude, almost from his first day in February 1874, set about to undercut him, ultimately successfully. That Froude was able to do this followed from his being both lucky and something of an organizational genius. His luck was to fall upon, and not stretching things, to fall in love with, India paper. This was a misnomer, but no matter. In 1874, a small stock of hyper-thin paper had come to Froude's attention, and he set into train experiments which successfully reproduced the Bible paper that made possible such tricks as scriptures that were no bigger than one's index finger, and later, copies of secular items such as massive poetry anthologies that now did not need a reading desk to support them. What the original paper was still is a matter of investigation, but the domestic version, of which Oxford had a monopoly, gave Froude real joy, and he delighted in it as if he had invented it himself. In 1876, Froude originated the Oxford Bible for Teachers, a great seller, carefully designed for the dissenting market, and in 1877 he foregrounded himself by producing a memorial Bible for the 400th anniversary of William Caxton's establishing his press at Westminster. In a single 12-hour period, this was printed, bound, and delivered to a public celebration headed by William Ewart Gladstone. Success followed success, and Froude in 1880 was appointed to replace Alexander Macmillan as the publisher to Oxford University. Froude was a full-time employee, but what the publisher's ambit was, no one quite knew. Publisher did not mean the same thing as it did in privately owned firms. He was not the owner, nor was Froude even a full surrogate for an owner. He had power of attorney on some financial matters, but not on others. Froude continually enlarged his role, being respectful of the delegates, and usually of the secretary to the delegates, who were his ultimate superiors, but he was a demon for expansion and unforgiving of inefficiency. He became a celebrity in the trade. Although few people in his own London business ever had a face-to-face meeting with him, by one of the legendary pieces of book wholesaling and distribution, he became internationally known. In 1881, the revised version of the New Testament, a joint project of Cambridge and Oxford universities, and a nightmare of academic punctiliousness and havering, finally was ready to be distributed. But the danger of pre-appearance copying was high, especially in the United States. Froude orchestrated the international distribution of 1 million copies from the London warehouse in a 24-hour period, pipping the pirates. By the early 1890s, he was still doing numerous Bibles, commissioning books published under his own name, and increasingly handling all save editorial details of books coming from Oxford via the secretary to the delegates. Some items, mostly Clarendon Press projects, were printed in Oxford, but the London business was the biggest source of revenue. A balanced assessment is that Froude was, in effect, Oxford's first full-time professional publisher, and his career marked the end of the long-standing press role of the gentlemanly polymath. It was largely Froude's tenacity which kept press operations moving during the drastic recession of the 1890s, and his vision which took it in important new directions in the new century. That was a fair picture from the publishing side. Nevertheless, one fully accepts that in his era, and in subsequent historical treatments, Froude was not a sympathetic figure among the culturally alert. He was genuinely acultural as far as high culture was concerned. Although he was sensitive to the market for high culture goods, famously, from the bankruptcy of its previous publisher, he bought the 66-volume World's Classics series. He saw books as objects. He reveled in them as such. What one is apt to miss if one only looks at him as a bookman is that Froude was an example of the second and third generations of leading brethren. In the last years of the 19th century, the new leadership among brethren of all sorts was the P.B. businessman. The first generation of leading brethren had been dominated by aristocrats and landed gentlemen, Derby, the Earl of Cavan, Lord Congleton, G.V. Wigram, and the like, Lady Powerscourt being the only female on the front benches. As these chief men were replaced through mortality, successful businessmen became the new brethren elite. The P.B. businessman became a social genre, and Froude was a pure type. Gimlet-eyed for the main chance, but meticulously observant of the letter of the law, sharp-elbowed, aggressive, hard on labor, and demanding of subordinates, but trustworthy for payment, and always having a degree of reserve that made it difficult for non-saints to judge the full length of the person. Although much less outgoing than the brethren whom Cyrus Scofield and Arno Gaebelein collected to fund the New Reference Bible, Froude was one of them, even if they had never met.